welcome to Off the Podium. I have Shiva Shafii with me, and Shiva, welcome to Off the Podium.
Oh, thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
So tell me a little bit about your background. Did you have a musical background, and how you got into more of an administrative role?
Sure. So I am originally from West Virginia. I was first introduced to classical music through my local orchestra's string education program. I was in fourth grade when a string quartet came to my school and played, and I immediately fell in love with the violin. I continued studying classical music all throughout high school and into college. And I was initially going to be a music performance major, and I studied at West Virginia University. And I ended up having an injury while I was in college, and my elbow. I ended up tearing my tendon in my elbow, and that just kind of completely changed the entire my entire pathway, basically, and like my journey and what I was going to do. I was pretty like dead set on just studying classical music. And when that happened, I took a break for a little while and moved back home and was trying to figure out what I wanted to do with my life. And then one day I was looking at Anna Kiko Myers. I was like trolling the internet at like 2 a.m., as like a 20-year-old or something. And she had just been awarded I think it was a Guarneri or a Strad. It was at the time the most expensive instrument in the world. And there was a video of her playing the third movement of the Barber Concerto. And I was like, wow, this is super cool. And so then I kept going down the rabbit hole and like saw all these articles about her. And then I ended up finding her publicist, which was Rebecca Davis at the time, through her website. And I was like, oh, that's a really interesting thought and idea. Classical music publicity, because I can like kind of pair the two things together. And so I sent a cold, I guess what was like my first pitch, really. I sent like my first email to Rebecca, and I was like, hi, I'm Shiva. This is what I do. This is like my resume. Would you be interested in having an intern? And that's really just kind of how it started.
Wow.
I ended up studying with her for a little bit, and then I ended up getting my first job with the West Virginia Symphony. And then after that, I landed in Seattle.
Wow. And what's your actual role with the Seattle Symphony?
I'm the director of communications.
And what does that mean for our audiences who might not know?
Yeah, so it's a pretty ever-changing role from what I've learned. It's like every single day is something different. But technically, I oversee a fantastic team that manages the orchestra's, I would say, like reputation. And included in that is the Seattle Symphony media under our record label. And there's like publicity, social media, all of the video, Encore, which is our program book. And yeah, so it's a lot of different stuff. And the best thing I think about communications is how much you collaborate with like every other department, because you're kind of like the central voice for the organization, which I find very, very appealing because you get to have like a bird's eye view.
Yeah, it's there's so many things I could ask you. There's so many things that are interesting for me specifically to this, and I've done about 80 episodes. I don't know if maybe I've had a couple of people who've had more of an administrative role, but you're really the only one that is really coming to mind right now that might be the first person who's doing this. The big question nowadays is future of orchestras.
Yeah.
After all of everything that's happening now, what will the future be? Or if you want to start earlier, what would orchestras be doing now? What our orchestras are doing now to engage with the audiences, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I honestly, the landscape is just completely changing now. I mean, it's a completely new realm and a completely new game, and I think orchestras are going to have to pivot and maneuver. This is kind of, I think, like made orchestras make a change. I mean, there have been so many orchestras for probably like, the past 10 years who have been talking about like technology. How do we connect with new audiences? How do we do this? And I mean, Berlin was like the first with the digital concert music hall, which is like phenomenal. But I always find that like the classical music industry has like a lag whenever it comes to technology and how we end up connecting to broader audiences. And when you think about that and like how much we need to connect, we always talk about needing to connect with new people, but then there's the fear, I think, of and risk in trying something new. Well, what if it doesn't capture like the artistic, like what if the artistic like integrity is compromised in this, or what if it doesn't sound as good, or what if people end up liking this more that they don't come in person? Like there's all these what ifs that I think end up driving orchestra's decision making into experimenting with these new things and really being at the forefront of new ways to create artistic experiences that it completely hinders us as a whole. And now with everything that's happened with the coronavirus, I think it's really just propelled everyone to really take a beat and think about this of like how are we going to sustain in the future. And I really think it's going to end up being like the digital is the way. And I I don't also think that it's going to be taking away from our current audiences. I think all it's going to be doing is building different audiences. You're still going to have people who want to come to the concert hall. And I think there's going to be a small percentage of people who hear and experience you online that would then be intrigued enough to come see you in person. And I think that's part of like the challenge and the goal that orchestras should be like thinking about, or just musicians in general, is like, how can I create something that's engaging enough online that people will be intrigued, so that way when they can come see me in person, they do.
Yeah, it's such a tough thing. But one thing that I noticed or realized that orchestras will most likely be very quick in changing is putting these videos out, because the unions have always prevented orchestras from putting footage out, and now this might change as well. What do you think?
Oh yeah, I mean, I think Seattle Symphony, I think, is one of the luckiest orchestras in the country in this aspect. We have a separate union that's different from the AFM, and so our musicians had separated some years ago and formed their own union. And one of the things that's really special about the situation here is that I think because of that separation from the AFM, we've been able to become one of like the most recorded orchestras. And if there are things that we want to try in terms of like video and technology and all that kind of stuff, we're able to work out a separate agreement with our musicians. And again, like in Seattle, that's so many of the musicians are like social media masterminds in and of themselves. Yeah. So they really understand the value of it. And I think as long as we work like really collaboratively in demonstrating the value of doing these different projects, then we won't have an issue here. At least I don't expect it. But other orchestras, I'm very curious to see how that plays out in other places.
Yeah, and Seattle Symphony tends to be a lot more innovative than many of the orchestras around the country and around the world. And which brings me to the point, and it's something that you agreed actually to talk about, is diversity and programming. And I don't know how involved you are with that, but I just would want people to know how that whole piece is put together, because a lot of people who don't know about orchestras think that for a major orchestra, even for major orchestras, the music director decides all of the repertoire and all this. How is the program put together? And, in this world with, trying to involve as many people as possible from different parts of the world, and making a really diverse program, how has Seattle Symphony managed to do that?
Well, I honestly think it goes back to the culture and the value of the institution as a whole, and how much you value diversity. I mean, we have the Seattle Symphony has an equity team, which I lead for the organization. But I think while there is like a central equity team that tries to talk about the culture of the organization and really understanding like systemic racism and the context in which our art form has came to be in its current form, and what ends up being valued in terms of in terms of like artistic programming, I yeah, again, I think it goes back to how much of a priority is it for the entire organization. And fortunately, with our previous VP of Artistic Planning, Elena Dubinets, she was absolutely brilliant, and that was one of the things that she really, really understood. And I think her and like Ludovic and now Thomas Dausgaard, and we just actually just this past week, our new vice president of artistic planning, Ralph Wilson, he also has an amazing track record of valuing and programming many different and diverse composers. So I think it turns into a holistic organization conversation of like, how many times do we really need to hear Beethoven? I love Beethoven. I love Bach. I love Brahms. All of them. I really do. But I think it's a balance, and understanding that, you know, having the same voices over and over and over reinforces one specific type of narrative and perspective. And if you really want to be an organization that connects to so many different people, then you need to be able to tell stories of all of these different people and share all of those perspectives in your programming on and off the stage.
Yeah. And how about if you come across someone who says, well, you know, if you don't program some of those big masters of 300, 200, even 100 years ago, even if it's Stravinsky or Shostakovich, people don't come to the concerts. What do you say to that?
Oh, personally, I think that's part of my job to sell it.
Yeah.
I think that's part of like the narrative and the story. You know, this happens over time. You can't convince someone the very first time that like this yellow pen is going to be like the next best thing. It has to, they need to like, one, have an affinity for something that's like yellow, and two, do they need a pen? And like, it's, have they seen it enough times, or have they written with it enough times in order to actually then feel like they need this yellow pen? So I think it's a disservice to so many different composers to only program them once and then be like, okay, I check mark, I did that, it's done. And not enough people came to this. Well, obviously, because they don't know it. I mean, it's not familiar for them. So.
That's a great point, actually. And, you know, because just one time, you don't, you know, it's just like I have almost an 8-month-old, and we try different things with him for him to eat and try, and he doesn't like certain things. But there are a couple of things we tried a couple of weeks ago and tried again just recently, and he seems to come around to it. It's like, okay, well, actually, I'm enjoying this. It's not too bad. So that just makes such perfect sense. And you've worked with a little bit smaller orchestras. How is your job kind of the same for a smaller orchestra, and now you're working with a bigger orchestra? Are there similarities, differences, and how do you, again, tying this into diversity in programming, with smaller orchestras, they have a smaller season, less smaller budget to maybe commission or even you know, rent all these parts. How do you do that with the smaller orchestra? Is it possible?
I think kind of like the same foundational issues end up applying it at the smaller places. I mean, I think you can look at orchestras like the California Symphony, and you know, they're much smaller, but they've done really incredible work in terms of diversity. Or like Chicago Sinfonietta, also really, really great work. At the West Virginia Symphony, I think there had been a very strong tradition of kind of playing like the bread and butter in classical music repertoire. And I think just recently there was a music director switch, and they're starting to but program many different composers. And I think it's been going really well for them. One of the programs that I was involved with right before coming to Seattle was we ended up commissioning a local composer, Matthew Jackfort, and paired a few local bands with the orchestra, and had this composer write all the arrangements. And I think that was like kind of the first foray for that organization to try some new commissions, and then it ended up leading very much into bringing a bunch of different composers later down the road. I haven't been as following as much since I've been in Seattle. But from what I've seen and from what I've heard, it's been really well received. But it's a long journey. You don't just again shift someone onto this idea that this is important overnight. I think it requires a bit of convincing and again familiarity of like bringing something back over and over again.
Yeah, you and your team probably have one of the toughest jobs in classical music, because in classical music, the main thing I hear from all these organizations or individuals is, how do I market? How do I get my product out there? And just share it with as many people as possible. Well, how does an individual market themselves, and how does that compare to, an orchestra or a big organization marketing and pushing the information out? I know it's a tough question. It's a big question.
Yeah.
You're welcome to answer it in any way you decide to.
Well, I think one of the things that maybe I'll start by clarifying is like the Seattle Symphony has a very interesting like structure. So the marketing wing and the communications wing are a little separated. With marketing, their primary goal is like sales and revenue for specific concerts. With the communications department, ours is more about like the storytelling aspect and the relationship aspect. And so that's really appealing to me, because if I think of it as like a funnel, I think the very first part of this funnel is the relationship and awareness band, I guess. And it's more of a long-term game. I don't think that people end up seeing revenue results from having like a good relationship with the public immediately, but it instills enough trust over time that it builds loyalty, which I think then feeds into marketing and how they end up turning those into sales. I would maybe what I would say is things that aren't necessarily different between individual, like branding yourself as an individual musician and an orchestra. I would say regardless of the two, there's some foundations that really need to be clearly identified. And as in like, what's your brand? Like, what's your personality? What are, again, values? What do you value? What do you want to say? Who are you as an artist? And I mean, I think about that those same principles apply as like an individual musician to an organization like the Seattle Symphony. I mean, I think about the Seattle Symphony's personality and artistic identity, and I think of like new commissions. I think of diversity in programming. I think of experimentation and innovation. And those are part of like the core things of what makes the Seattle Symphony so unique. I also think about like flexibility in sound. I think our orchestra is one of the most like adaptable orchestras, where they can jump from like Mozart to Beethoven to John Luther Adams and like that. And I think that's very unique to this orchestra.
Yeah. And musician, from a musician's perspective, that's also a tough thing to do when you're jumping from one thing to the next. It takes a different mindset, and you're right. Seattle Symphony always seems to impress with all kinds of interesting programming, and the musicians are just fantastic. It's truly a world-class orchestra. How do one thing I really wish that classical music did more of is, I just want to see it everywhere. I maybe it's a wrong perspective, but I just wish it was on the news, like concerts were, and I know maybe some people don't watch TV, but I just wish it was out there a lot more. It was in the, just the news, or it had a regular, some kind of a Netflix special that was just a yearly season going on. I don't know. I'm not the greatest person to think about this, but I just want to know, I mean, what do you think? I just really wish it was just out there more. That's what I wish. And how can we get it out there more? How can we share it with more people? Because it's such a fantastic thing. And if people have the opportunity to learn about it and be educated about it, I think more people would love it and be passionate about it. I just think it's not shared enough. How can we get there where it's shared in many more places?
Yeah, I mean, I 100% absolutely agree. I I have so many friends who are not classical musicians, and that's they're always like a fun testing ground, I think, for me. Like whenever I pitch different ideas or just like ways in which I'm talking about a specific program or concert, and seeing like how they react or whether or not they think it's like interesting. And 9 times out of 10, when someone who has no idea what classical music is or isn't familiar at all, they come to a concert and they leave and they're like, "Oh my gosh, I had no idea that I would enjoy this that much," and that's such a thrill. I love seeing that, but I completely agree. And I think before I answer like what can we do to make it there, I think it's important to kind of acknowledge the context in which why we're currently where we are. And I think a lot of that comes from, I mean, the relationship that orchestras and classical music had with I think like the media and like major newspapers, 20, 30 years ago is very, very different from what it is now. I mean, as like the media is currently shrinking in terms of like print. I mean, the Seattle Times, whenever I first came to Seattle 3 years ago, I mean, the newspaper was like this thick. I get the Seattle Times now, and it's like this thin.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's a big difference, just in 3 years. And I mean, I think the amount of coverage that they have and the amount of time and resources that like the media has in general to be able to devote to something like this is becoming tougher and tougher to obtain. And I think part of that is our responsibility in demonstrating value. But then a reality of how many people are actually subscribing to old traditional ways of consuming information. And so I think part of the answer is actually tied into that because people are changing the way that they consume information and consume news. And we're such a tradition-based art form that had been kind of stuck for a long time of trying to still maintain the same level of like media coverage that we had in the past. I think that's part of like what's hindered us as an entire field. And so now I think it's really just like you become your own newsroom. Like, and that's what the orchestra here has done. I mean, we have like we've had our own blog for however many years that's been happening, all of the increased work on social media, and then we do like still continue to pitch like very aggressively in order to get coverage. But I think it's about knowing who you are, knowing what you want to be known for. I think it's like having that end goal in mind and then continuing to storytell through any way possible. You have to constantly be creative, collaborate with new artists, and really get your story out there.
Yeah. Well, you came to the administrative role because of an injury, but other musicians, young musicians, they might not get the career they wanted. Many might not be able to have the success that they wanted. What advice would you give to young musicians, as someone who is experienced and successful at what you do? What advice would you give to young musicians, kind of starting out their career, or maybe someone who's 22, just out of college and trying to figure things out?
I think it's so tough because I didn't even know that this was a field or like an option when I was in music school, and I think that's one of the things that's structurally starting to, I hope and see change now, is how much music schools are talking about alternative like career paths or ways that the intersections of different things that you love. I would actually say to probably start exploring those intersections, like, and be a bit more try to be as self-aware as possible, really. It's like, what other things do you enjoy? Like for me in music, I learned through music school and through studying that I really enjoyed convincing my non-music friends to come to concerts. And, it was because of that, like because of those, observations that I was able to make, it ended up making so much more sense that like this role and this career path fit really well with both like my personality and the things that I love to do. So I find as many like mentors as possible. Don't be afraid to just like shoot that cold email. You have no idea like who's going to tell you no? And yeah, I would really just say like anyone can reach out to anyone nearly all, at any time. I mean, the industry, as competitive and as like cutthroat as it is, I think it's also one of the most helpful communities that like really tries to bring people up in terms, at least like I've been seeing that on the administrative side.
Well, we learned a little bit about you and what you do. I'm sure there's much more, but I want to know, this is a fun question I like. I want to know something that people that know you or follow your career don't know about you. What would they not know about you that you're willing to share with us?
I'm kind of an open book. Let's see. I love, well, I mean, anyone who follows me on like social media will see all this stuff, but like I love to cook. This is a fun one. I guess my background is Iranian, and I would spend every summer in Iran growing up. And so I basically grew up on my grandparents' farm there. And so I think what's kind of funny is, as much as I love like culture, city life, all of these really incredible things that a city has to offer, my absolute favorite thing, I think if I could just like get away, is just being on some random farm with a book, reading, writing.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, being completely by myself. And I had a pet goat too when I was 5. That was pretty fun. Yeah, I would so want to farm again.
And reading your name, I realized your background. Armenia, where I'm from, is bordering Iran, and my grandfather from my mom's side, who is Armenian, but Armenians have long lived in Iran, and he actually was born in Iran. And so his family moved to Armenia in the 40s, I think, and then my mom was born in Armenia, and so yeah, I have that little connection with Iran. So there it is.
It's always fun. I mean, there aren't very many of us, I think, in the classical music field as a whole, and that's always been so fascinating to me to see how much people end up like finding each other from these cultural connections too.
And I was gonna ask, I don't know if you know this, is just completely random question, but who are some famous Iranian composers or conductors that come to mind?
Well, one of my favorite, I mean, musicians, harpsichordist Mahan Esfahani. I think he's just absolutely brilliant. The last time that I was in Iran, I was able to meet Shahdad Rouhani, who was the conductor for the Tehran Symphony Orchestra, and he had just started to really rebuild that program and that entire orchestra since it had been shut down after the revolution there, and that was pretty amazing to see. There's flutist Mehdi Gholami. He's also pretty great. Yeah, I mean, there's tons. Kian Sultani, fabulous cellist.
Uh-huh. So, wow. Okay. Well, that's great. Yeah. I didn't even know some of those names, so it's great. Thank you for sharing. This is great. Thank you, Shiva.
No, likewise. Thank you so much.
We talk about more things. I mean, is there anything that you really wanted to talk about? Something that you're passionate about? You want to bring up and talk about, or?
No. I don't think so. I think we went through quite a bit.
Yeah, no, it's great. I thank you so much for being on. Hopefully we could do this another time, and hopefully in person. I like doing these in person, but with everything that's happening now, it's really tough to make it happen.
No, totally. It absolutely is. Well, thank you so much for having me. This was very fun.
Thank you. Have a beautiful day.
You too. Bye.